And we are on. And everybody, welcome to Book Think number 5 here on the Fantasy Thinker. I gotta do the right thing there. Uh, there you go. And today I have with me special guests, Dr. Philip Chase, who just for the one or two people who might not know who he is a booktuber with on Philip Chase, The Best of Fantasy, and also author of the Edan Trilogy, of which I recently finished this wonderful third book in the trilogy. Great stuff there, Philip. And you are also a professor of medieval studies. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, medieval literature. Yeah.
Medieval literature. Okay. Medieval literature. And so I am so excited to have you on my channel today. And because you picked an interesting thing to talk about today. Normally I would have somebody on talking about a book and, talking about a single book. But you chose some uh, old English poems
Yeah.
to talk about that are not Beowulf, which, of course, everybody knows about Beowulf.
I figure most people at least know about
Yeah.
Beowulf.
And you've had plenty of talks on your channel about Beowulf.
Yeah, well, actually, mostly
Well,
on other people's channels, but I've been
most
at
of it. Okay.
several channels on talking about Beowulf. Mike's channel, Andy Smith's channel. I did have Tom Shippey on my channel recently.
Yes.
Tom
Right.
Shippey's a renowned scholar, and he's done a translation of Beowulf recently. I have one of his books here. I have my copy of The Ruin, which is one of the poems we're talking about, and this is Shippey edited, translated this book. So yeah, I have talked about Beowulf enough on YouTube.
Yeah.
And I should apologize. I'm sorry I made you read Old English poetry,
No, okay.
but
No,
I
that's
think these are really cool, and I hope that people will agree by the time we're done talking about them.
yeah. I read them, and they're not too long, so it's not
They're
like
short, yeah.
it wasn't like I was sweating bullets or anything like that. But I was reading just of course I'm reading translations,
Yeah.
and I ran across this website called the Old English Poetry Project.
Oh yes. Yeah.
So you might be familiar with that. So that's where I found all these poems you mentioned, and
Nice.
yeah, they were pretty fascinating. The historian in me was was wondering about these poems and when they were written. Is there an idea of when exactly they were written, or is it more of a educated guess type of thing?
So we're talking about the 4 poems that I feel like I assigned you homework here, but
I like homework. It's all right.
the 4 poems that we're talking about, the Wanderer and the Ruin and the Wife's Lament, 3 of them are in the Exeter book, which is a manuscript that is housed in Exeter Cathedral. I have my copy of it here. Is the old this is going to sound awful, but it's Crap and Dobby are the they edited this series. I don't know if you can see that or not, but
Yeah.
so this is in Old English, and I have those 3 are included in this. Basically, it's a book that gives modern print and everything like that, but it's in Old English. So I have those 3 poems in there, and I'm not sure exactly. I know I'm going to guess that the manuscript itself dates from somewhere around 1000 or so AD. I know that's true of the Beowulf manuscript, but that Beowulf itself is almost certainly centuries older than the manuscript, and that's probably true for much of the poems that were collected in the Exeter book. And a lot of them are actually riddles, because people back then were fond of riddles. That's where Tolkien got the idea of the riddling with Bilbo and Gollum from. So a lot of the poems in the Exeter book are riddles, in addition to some really great poetry. My favorite poetry outside of Beowulf in Old English most of it comes from the Exeter book.
Okay, cool.
And there are various poems that are also good that are not in the Exeter book that are fairly well known, like Dream of the Rood is one, and the Rune poem is another one. But yeah, there's a wealth of really great Old English poetry outside of Beowulf that, I think that fantasy lovers would find the themes fascinating. And you mentioned an appreciation of history, the sense of the past that is just everywhere. It absolutely permeates Old English poetry.
Hmm.
Is a huge thing. The idea of dust showing, which is the idea of looking at the past with a sense of deep mourning and melancholy, and there's
Yes.
the idea that where are those who came before. That's something that pervades Old English poetry. So if you're a history lover, if you're a lover of things in the past, I think a lot of fantasy gets its it tends to look backward a lot of the time, and I think a lot of that comes from medieval literature, which is often very backward looking in many ways. We will.
Right. And Tolkien was a scholar of this stuff, right?
That's right.
So
That's right.
you wonder how many people realized that his sense of, like what you said, what had gone before, the people's lamenting what had gone before, and trying to
Right.
find out what had gone before, was
Straight
infused in
out of
his,
Old English.
yeah,
Yeah.
infused in his works, and then therefore unconsciously maybe infused in some other works later on when they were trying to
Yep. Yep.
write fantasy in that manner.
That's
Uh,
right. And then,
that's
of course, there's an added layer to all of this today, because those of us who study this, it's a dead language. You can't understand Old English unless you study it. And so it's this added layer of we're looking on these people from the past in a
Mhm.
language that is no longer spoken, really. And modern English is considerably different from Old English.
Sure, yeah,
And they were looking back on the past. So it's this
right.
sense of, time keeps running, and all that we know will be gone someday. And that's the life is fleeting, that kind of thing. It's just all over this poetry. Yeah.
And some of these manuscripts are, of course, they were written down much later. They're taken from like oral tradition.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
So a lot of these go back before Christianity came into the picture for the Anglo-Saxons, and they were handed down by bards. And shop is what the Old English word is for a bard, a
sure.
shaper,
Oh,
essentially,
okay,
which is
yeah.
the word I use in
Yes, it is. Yeah.
my novel, shaper. So I'm taking that right out of Old English. And they would hand these down orally. And at some point, Christianity comes into the picture, really, in the case of Roman Catholicism in 597.
Yeah.
Pope Gregory sends Augustine to England to start converting them, starting with the Kingdom of Kent. And then also they're being converted from the north by Celtic Christians, mostly Irish monks and that sort of thing.
Right.
So they, within a century or so, mostly Christian. And one of the great things about that is that, of course, it introduces literacy,
Yeah.
and a lot of this stuff gets written down. But in the process of being written down by converts to Christianity, a lot of it gets changed to some degree. Like you can see
Sure.
lots of echoes of the pagan past, but at the same time, you cannot deny the influence of Christianity.
Nice, nice. And as I was reading through them, I'm trying to like read them, and you try to get a sense of what life was like back then
Yeah,
as you're reading them, because and
sure.
it's a little different than what I was used to studying, because these are kind of slice of life. They're poems. They're more tales, and
Yeah.
because I was used to like looking up like old documents, like from basic documents in medieval history,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and these are more like laws and accountings on land and stuff like that. And
Right.
so you get a sense, you had to look at it, why was the law made, and because something was going on, so they had to make a law.
Right.
Whereas these poems are more musings about life at the time that they were told, and it gives you a different perspective of how people looked at where they were living and how they were living and stuff like that. And I
Oh,
found that
absolutely.
very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And certain themes I think very much speak to us today. They're part of the human experience,
Sure.
and others of them there are the particulars of their culture which have disappeared, can be equally fascinating as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what language is Old English most related to?
So it's one of the Germanic
It is
languages.
Germanic.
If
Okay.
you think of Indo-European, one of the branches of Indo-European
Yeah.
is Germanic. So if you think of Proto-Germanic, which then splits into three different directions, one is the Eastern Germanic, which gave us the Gothic languages, which are now extinct. So are no more living Eastern Germanic languages. But then there's Northern Germanic, which gives us all the Scandinavian languages, and
Mhm.
Old Norse is kind of a descendant language there, which is what the sagas are written in.
Right.
And then the Western Germanic branch includes English and Dutch and Frisian and German, and various dialects of German and that sort of thing. But yeah, that's essentially it. And of all those, the closest living language to English is Frisian, and with
Ah.
Dutch being probably a bit closer to English than, say, German is.
Oh, okay. All
Yeah.
right. That's cool.
But
Yeah. And
but
of
that's
course,
going way back. And English has
yeah, yeah,
changed a
yeah.
lot because of the Norman conquest and the infusion of French words,
Romantic languages. Yeah.
Latin words.
Yeah.
So English is, in terms of its vocabulary, has actually changed quite a bit.
Yeah. Right. It certainly has. Awesome. And all right. So let's look at this. The first, the Wanderer is the one I have up here,
Great. Yeah, let's talk about the Wanderer.
and
So,
I can actually put it up here. I think. Oh wait. There we
oh,
go.
sweet. Yeah,
There we
nice.
go. Okay. Um, and
That's quite
so
a translation. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, this is right. This is a translation, and
Right.
I don't know if it matches the translation that you might have, or how closely they
No,
would
that's
match.
fine. Yeah, I mean, they're all. I have the Old English actually, so I
Right.
could read a couple passages from there. But yeah,
Oh,
this is a poem that is essentially about an exile, which is an
yeah.
important theme in the context of the culture, because your entire identity came from your tribe, came from your people, especially way back in the pagan days. And so the idea of being in exile is worse than death, because everything is stripped away from you. Everything that gave your life meaning, you're essentially walking around a shell of a human being because you have no meaning any longer. Everyone that gave you meaning is gone. And this could happen, you could be exiled, or you could be the last survivor of your people, which this person seems to be. The wanderer essentially is a kind of a last survivor situation, perhaps. But the relationships that gave this individual meaning are gone. And that is part of that life is fleeting uber theme in Old English poetry. But it also gets repurposed for a Christian, in the context of, yes, life in this world is fleeting, but you can have some hope in an afterlife. So that's kind of what frames this idea of, well, this world is pretty much going to go to crap, so you better better put your bets on an afterlife if you want to have anything permanent. So that's kind of the gist of it, really. But there's some really poignant moments in this poem. I'd like to point out actually a
Yeah.
section, if you don't
Please
mind.
do. Yeah.
So lines 92 or so, starting with line 92, is where the bit that I want to read begins. And you'll recognize this if you are a fan of Lord of the Rings. When I
Oh, okay.
read, I'll translate it. I'll read it in Old English
Yeah.
first,
Yeah. Please do. Yeah. That's great.
and then I will translate it, and we can look at your translation as well. So, in Old English, it sounds like this: "Whar kom mearg, whar kom mago, whar kom mathum giva, whar kom simla yasetu, whar zindon sela dreamos, e alla bercht buna, e alla bernwiga, e alla theo nastrim, hu se thrag yawat, yanap under nicht heln, swaheo newara." So that
Wow.
translates. Yeah, it's good stuff in Old
Yeah.
English. It's
There's a
really,
lot of like rolling letters in there. Like
yeah, yeah.
pretty
I,
cool.
I like to roll my R's too. So, but it means something like, "Where has the steed gone?" Where the kinsman? Where the treasure giver? The treasure giver is the Lord, is the person's. You're
Yeah.
in one of the most important relationships outside of your kin, your family, is that with your Lord,
Hmm.
who gives you protection, gives you a place in the world, and in return, you give that Lord your utmost loyalty.
Yeah.
So all these things are gone for this figure, the wanderer, the Stapa. So where is the steed gone? Where are the kinsmen? Where the treasure giver? Where is the feasting place? Where the hall joys? Alas for the bright cup. Alas for the mailed warrior. Alas, the prince's glory. How that time has departed, darkened under night's shadow, as if it never were. And
Wow.
that's roughly what it means in Old English. And your
That's
translation is
fascinating. Yeah.
very similar.
Yeah. It's similar. It's a little different, but it's similar. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it was easy to follow along.
And of
Um,
course, that speech is very much what Tolkien put in Lord of the Rings, something that was spoken by Theoden at a particular moment when things aren't looking very grim. So yeah, there's a. You mentioned Tolkien earlier, yeah, and this is very much his wheelhouse, as it were.
yeah, it feels like it has that feel. Yeah. Uh, wow. That's fascinating. That's fascinating. Just to hear that, to hear how it was spoken originally, and then to hear a translation, and then to see how it can be translated just slightly differently, by somebody else, and then
Sure.
and and that um, that sense, you really do get that sense that he's missing things, he's alone, and that it's it has a melancholy feel to it.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, very
beautiful.
much so. And there are moments when he sees visions of his people. And he's wandering in this cold place and there are waves and seagulls crying, and it's all very dreary and sad and melancholy.
Yeah.
And he sees almost like ghosts of them hovering over the waters and that sort of thing. So he's very much a haunted individual who's in a terrible state, but it has that little bit of I guess you could say, a ray of light.
Yeah, the very last, like, 2 or 3 lines there.
Very
Yeah,
last bit,
yeah,
exactly.
'cause,
Where
I
it
do.
seems like maybe there's an afterlife where it's going to be okay.
Yeah, and I do like, that, all this stuff is on loan, basically, all the the money, the friends, the
All of
family,
it,
everything's on loan, until
everything is fleeting.
yeah, everything's fleeting, that's good, yeah.
Wealth is fleeting. Here, friend is fleeting. Here, family is fleeting. Here, humanity is fleeting. That's kind of
Oh, wow,
yeah.
nice.
That is yeah. All this resting place, Earth, Middle Earth, shall become empty, right? So yeah, I mean it's kind of bleak,
Yeah,
kind of bleak in a way, um, but at the same time, there's a beauty to it as well. I think so. Yeah,
yeah,
and I see you
so
have the wife's lament
The
there.
Wife's Lament, the next one, seemed to be similarly bleak, but in a different way.
Yeah, this one is, I would say so. Now, a little bit of context to help understand the wife's
Oh,
lament. A lot of the Old English poetry is very male centric.
mhm,
It's a fairly patriarchal society. There's a lot
yeah,
of focus on warriors and all of that. But one of the prominent roles talked about in the poetry is that of the peace weaver, which is to say a noble woman, usually say, for example, the daughter of the king, who would be married off to a rival kingdom or a rival tribe in order to make peace between peoples who had formerly been at each other's throats, because they had all these feuds going on and these territorial battles and what have you. So in order to occasionally make peace, they would make marriage alliances, and
sure.
this usually a daughter of the leader would be married off to a rival tribe. And what we have in the Wife's Lament might be, it's an interesting poem because it is very much open to interpretation. It's one of, by the way, the few Old English poems we have that is spoken with a woman's voice.
Right. Okay.
There aren't too many where it's clearly a female voice. And what we think, or one interpretation of it, is that what we have here is possibly a peace weaver, a woman who is married from her people, her tribe, to a rival tribe in order to make peace. And often, as you hear about in Beowulf, these arrangements don't go very well because sometime along the woman's family comes to visit the former rivals for a big feast to celebrate 1 year of peace or whatever, and so you'll have them visit and everything's going well, everybody's starting to get a bit drunk with all the mead in the mead hall, and maybe one of the old warriors takes one of the hosts takes a younger warrior aside and says, "Hey, you see that guy over there, that fellow, you see him, you see that sword he's wearing? That was your father's sword. You know what that means? That means his dad killed your dad. What are you going to do about it?" And before you know it, you've got a brawl going on, and the piece is broken, and they're at it again. And this sort of thing would happen all the time. So these efforts at these fragile efforts at civilization and peace were always being undermined, let's say, by our worst nature. And that's something that might have happened in this poem. You have a woman who is lamenting. On the surface of it, it seems like her husband has somehow been distanced from her, and that her husband's family is hostile to her, and that she's you pick that much up, right?
Yeah, it seemed like she had some trouble with in-laws, and
yep,
and that she wasn't very happy in her marriage to begin with. So that's kind of what I picked up off of that, and I found that very interesting, like you said, because I hadn't seen something this old with a woman's point of view before, and so that was interesting. But maybe you have a short passage from this one too.
Sure. Yeah. No, there's a key moment in this poem that I do want to focus on, and I find it very interesting. And it's the moment where my personal interpretation, not just my personal, but it is, I think, a fairly well-known interpretation, but is one of many possibilities. But it's what it hinges on, essentially. And it's lines starting with line 27 or so.
27.
Yeah.
Alrighty, so somewhere around here.
I'm just going to read a couple lines, 27 and 28. And I'll tell you why they're important after I read this bit.
Sure.
Hecht mech mon wunion on wuder berwa, under actreo in tham scrava. Okay, so I'm actually curious to see how that's translated in your version. Where does that start? I don't. Oh, okay.
Maybe he was the one.
Yep. He was the one who said I should go live in the woods or something, sit under an oak tree in a gravel pit. Okay, so they translate scrava as gravel pit, which I don't think is a very good translation, to be honest with you. I would disagree with that translation. I have a translation here that is actually much more accurate, in my opinion. So I was told to live in a grove of trees under an oak in an earthen cave.
Earthen cave. Okay. All right.
So a pit versus a cave. Nice. Either way, a pit or a cave. I think either one works, because what I think we have here, I mentioned how they were very fond of riddles before, right?
Oh yeah. Yep.
So these riddles consist often of inanimate objects that are talking to you, the hearer or the reader, and you have to guess what they are. So it'll be like, I don't know, something inanimate that's talking, and it gives you all these little clues about what it is. It might be an onion or something, or whatever. And you have to, that's an onion based on its little dialogue. I think what we have here might be, in fact, similar in a certain respect. What we have may be the idea that this woman has been exiled from not just her original people, but from the people she was married into. And that her husband, who seems to have loved her, at least on some level, has agreed to basically casting her out.
Ah, I see. Yeah.
But it's actually more sinister than that even. I believe that this pit or cave that she's in is in fact her grave. and that who is speaking is not a live woman, but is the ghost of a woman. And she is lamenting not just that her husband has rejected her, but he agreed to her death because this effort at peace weaving failed, and they decided to reject the peace and execute the woman. And so what we have here is a ghost speaking to us about
Huh.
the sorrow of her current situation as she speaks from this cave or pit or grave, as it were, under an oak.
So
Yeah.
that's pretty dark.
Pretty dark stuff.
Yeah.
Pretty dark stuff. Yeah. Yep. 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 So like once again, life is fleeting. Yeah.
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 Wow.
Yep. And that effort at peace didn't quite work out.
Yeah. Uh, Jeez. It. But at the end, yeah, because at the end she kind of mentions he'll remember. So maybe it's her husband remembering her.
Sure. Because it sounds like they did have some good times. Like they might have actually
Yeah.
loved each
And
other.
how, yeah, like how full of pleasure the home was and stuff, and what woes it is.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Uh, so that's interesting. That makes, wow, that's an interesting take on that. It
Yep.
it makes it the writer of the poem, or the speaker at the time, um, really put a little dark tale into it. A little, uh, something that's not. It makes you wonder, like how much they thought on this stuff, and how grim some of the stories might have gotten. Because it
Yeah.
definitely wasn't a happy poem.
No, unfortunately, and you're probably picking up on a bit of a theme here. Old English poetry tends to be a bit on the melancholy side.
Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah.
did. Although, coming up, I think there's one of them that's a little lighter, but
Maybe.
maybe.
I mean, there is humor. You will find some understatement and that sort of thing in Old English poetry,
Right.
and there's plenty of beauty in Old English poetry as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's not all gloom and doom, just mostly.
The next one, the
Ruin.
next one you got here is the ruin, which to me was somebody describing some ruins he came across. Um,
Precisely. Yeah.
and that I thought that was pretty cool because it really reminded me, like you mentioned fantasy literature earlier. That really reminded me of a lot of fantasy literature I've read, where a lot
Yeah.
of it has this deep past that has a lot of ruins.
Yep.
Um, and this just definitely reminded me of that.
Very much so. And that's one reason I selected it. I figured this would be one that would be kind of cool for us fantasy lovers.
Yeah,
But I also think there's some really interesting, almost like meta points about the ruin that I think might be interesting to hear about. There's
sure.
some context, I think, is helpful here. So the Anglo-Saxons invaded what is now England at a time when the Romans were departing. The Roman Empire was crumbling. This was
Right.
around 410. Actually, in 410, the Romans basically left the
Yep.
Celtic populace, the Britons, on their own. They said, "All right, sorry, our empire is falling apart. You're less important. Bye." And the legions left, basically leaving these Britons, the descendants of which are the Welsh, on their own, and leaving them open to the attacks, the eventual attacks of the Anglo-Saxons, and who included not just Angles and Saxons, but also Jutes and Frisians. And
Yes.
initially, they might have been mercenaries, actually brought on board by a local king in order to fight some other invaders. There were Irish invading from the other side as well. So, whatever the reason, the Anglo-Saxons decided they were going to stay and invited some of their relatives and friends to come on over. And so they did in large numbers, and either pushed out the native Britons eventually, or mixed with them, or whatever. There's probably a complex story there, but in any case, go fast forward a couple hundred years, and these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were now settled. The heptarchy, they call it. There were these 7 kingdoms, Wessex and Mercia and Northumbria being prominent
Right.
among them. But among these kingdoms were the past vestiges of Roman occupation,
Right.
including these towns, which had architecture which these barbarians never could have built themselves. And so they looked on these works after a
Right.
couple hundred years, which were crumbling and
Because the Romans had pretty sophisticated stuff for their
indeed,
time. Yeah.
indeed. Yeah. So, I think they mythologized it a little bit. They
Mm,
would refer to
sure.
works from the past as the old works of giants, right? Because
Yes. Yeah.
who
Yeah.
else could have piled stone onto stone in such a manner? Who else
Yeah.
could have built, weapons that last so long? Who else could have, had such, supernatural almost technology? So I don't think they were completely ignorant, but they let their imaginations go a little bit,
Well,
perhaps.
especially when you're trying to tell a story.
Exactly.
You're gonna let that
Exactly.
imagination come out. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So with again a sort of poignant sense of life's fleetingness and how the civilizations of the past are basically crumbling and whole nations and peoples that once existed no longer do. And that's just and you look, that's a mirror of a sort too, because if that
Mhm.
happened to others, that's going to happen to us as well.
Right. Yep.
So that's what this poem is about. Essentially, it's a description of an old, probably Roman ruin. And just to make this even more, I think, interesting, the manuscript is in rough shape, as you can see. All of those in your translation, X's
Oh,
there.
that's what the X's are. Okay.
There are holes in the manuscript.
Ah,
It's corrupt. Which again, it's almost fitting, isn't it, that this old manuscript would
that
be
is
falling apart, as this poem itself describes an old ruin falling apart, right?
apropos, as we would say. Yeah.
Yep. So looking back, layers and layers of the past.
Nice.
I can just read the opening lines there if you like.
Sure. Yeah.
Ratlich is this whalestan, weirda je brakon, burgstede burstan, bros not enter je werk. There you go, the old works of giants. Enter je werk.
Nice.
Which is, ent, of course, is a word that Tolkien
He,
borrowed.
he did. Yeah. Right.
Meaning giant, it's a cognate with the Norse Jotun. So yeah, and there's also another word there, fate, weirda. So it's broken by
Right.
fate, weirda jebrakon. So that's a key concept in Old English poetry as well. That comes up a lot, fate. So
Yeah.
yeah,
That's fascinating. Yeah.
yep, and it's translated here as calamities, but really the word is simply fate. Weirda jebrachon. Yeah. So yeah, so a couple key concepts in Old English poetry are on display in the ruin.
Nice. That's just fascinating. I love that part of it. And this one was really short.
Yeah,
Didn't
that's a
yeah,
fairly short. It's probably
really short one.
the Wife's Lament is also pretty short, but
Yeah, yeah. And it does mention, that there might have been baths and there might have been
yes,
a kingly thing or something like that. And
yeah. I mean, have you ever been to Bath, or as the
let's see.
English would say, Bath?
Bath. No, I have not, unfortunately, but
Okay,
I've seen
yeah.
pictures.
You can
And
still see in the city of Bath in southwestern England the Roman baths that were
right.
there. Even take a dip if you want, I think. Yeah. And so the layers and layers of it's a fascinating little city because there is also a medieval church that is quite beautiful there, but there's also all these. Bath is fascinating because all these 18th century homes built by wealthy people who probably used the baths, I would imagine.
Hmm.
But this Georgian architecture dominates the city. So you have the Roman ruins, you have the medieval church, you have the Georgian architecture all in one place, and of course, it's a modern city lived in by
But
modern
yeah,
people. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. And it was fascinating how much description that the poem put into what he was trying to he was trying to describe these places, and he puts a lot of poetry into the description of the ruins. And
yeah,
I
yeah,
really thought
yeah.
that was
That sense of the past is
very
really
cool. Yeah.
very, very strong in that one. Yeah.
All right. And this fourth one you gave me, the rune poem,
Yes.
I imagine that he's listing out runes.
Correct. You don't have the runes there. But I don't know if you can see very well in my copy here, but you can see off to the side there, every one of these
Oh,
stanzas has
oh,
a
okay.
rune next to it.
Let
Um,
me
let me get
let
it
me
close.
make the picture bigger here.
Okay,
Okay.
there.
Yeah.
So
Oh, I see. Yep.
you can see the runes. It's the Futhark, uh,
Yes.
which has an Old Norse version as
Nice.
well, but this is the Old English version of the Futhark.
Right. Yeah.
And it has been written down, which means Christians have entered the equation, and it gets Christianized to some degree because these runes probably there was some Roman influence because the pagan Germanic peoples were not literate, and they were seen as magical almost. Like there is a kind of magic if you're not from a literate culture. There is a kind of magic to literacy.
To
Like
writing. Yeah. Right.
I
Yeah.
can write something down, not say a word, show it to you, and you'll know what was in my mind to some degree,
Right.
right?
And even after you're dead.
That's right. Long
It'll
after I'm
still be
dead, I'm
there.
still
That's
communicating with
that's
people. Yeah,
magical. Yeah.
it is magical. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there was a, they would use these runes in even in the pagan times before they were Christianized to endow certain objects with,
Yep.
protective abilities or what have you. They meant something.
Yep.
And you would find, in the case of Scandinavia, you find gravestones carved in these runes. And even
Right.
in the Old English context, there are some. I mentioned an Old English poem called "The Dream of the Rood" earlier. That actually poem was carved onto a stone in runes as well at
Oh
a certain
wow.
point. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's so mainly they were used for carving and etching and that sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Because
But it's
The Norse people had runes too, and
correct. Yeah.
yeah, runes.
Essentially, they at some point in the Proto-Germanic times probably borrowed them, and they spread to the northern branch of the Germanic peoples. In other words,
Right. Okay.
Vikings.
Yeah. Yeah.
They had runes, but so did the Anglo-Saxons as well,
Yes.
and they used them for similar things. So what we have here is the Old English or Anglo-Saxon version of the runes, which are slightly different actually. There are minor differences, and one has more letters than another, and that sort of
Sure.
thing. But they're pretty much they're both called the Futhark.
Futhark. Yep.
So and first letter being F, or we would call F, or Feoch was the name of the rune, and the second letter being Ur, which we would call a U, and then the next letter would be Thorn, which we would use TH for. So it's, in other words, it's the Futhark. It's the first 6 letters that this runic alphabet is named after.
Oh, okay. And so they just call it that. Yeah,
Yep,
that's cool.
yep, yep. Now, this poem is sort of a gnomic poem in the sense that each of the runes appears, and there's a little bit of wisdom that follows each one.
Oh, yeah,
It's
yeah. That's what it seems like. Yeah.
yeah. So feoch is the Old English word. It's where we get our word fee, by the way.
Oh,
And
okay.
it originally meant something like cattle, but also money, because of your wealth in olden times was measured by your cattle,
Yeah.
right?
Well, there's your cattle. Yeah. Right.
Is your cattle. So one way of translating this opening bit is money is a comfort to every man, just the same. Everyone ought to give it away freely if they want to receive approval when they face the Lord. And that's the Tom Shippey translation I just read,
Hmm.
which is the book I have here. And yeah, what you have there is fairly
Very
similar.
similar. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And the next one, Ur, and I can read one in Old English if you want as
Sure.
well.
Yeah.
I'll read the first one, Feoch. Feoch bith frovr, fira jahwilchum, shale theach mana jahwilch, miklen hit dalan, if he willa for drichna, domes hleotan. So yeah, that's the opening one. And then Ur is the ox. The wild
Or
ox is
nice.
fearless, has enormous horns. It is a very fierce animal. It fights with its horns, a famous roamer of the moors. That is a brave creature, right?
Brave. Okay. Proud. Brave.
That is moody wucht, right? That is a brave. White actually is where Wight is a word you'll see, and George Martin uses that word. It just means
Yes,
creature. Yeah.
he does. Yeah.
So yeah, then there's Thorn, and the next one after Thorn is kind of interesting. We can maybe stop on that one. The fourth one, which you have it translated there as the mouth is the beginning of all speech, a
Mhm.
support to wisdom and a comfort to the wise, and a prosperity and trust to every earl. Now, mouth here is taken from Latin. In
Oh,
the
okay.
original Futhark, Os means the gods or the god. In
Oh,
this case,
okay.
probably Woden.
Yep.
But the Anglo-Saxon early Christians decided to Bowdlerize this,
Right. Yeah.
and instead of Woden or the god, they changed it to they used a clever little like, oh, we'll call it the mouth, right?
Yeah. Can't put the
Because
pagan stuff in there. Gotta.
can't let that pagan stuff in. So yeah, that's an interesting one, I think, in that sense.
That's great.
Yeah. So yeah, this one's a lot of fun, and if you ever
Yeah,
want
it
to learn
is.
how to write runes, it's there for you.
Oh yeah, you can find those, and it was kind of fun because it just goes down. The whole thing just keeps going down and giving you new terms,
The whole alphabet. Yep,
and they keep telling you what they mean and stuff like that.
exactly.
And it has a rhythm, and it has a certain cadence to it
Oh, very
that
much so. Very much so.
that
Yeah.
makes it poem like, I found that I found it enjoyable to read actually, so it was kind of neat.
Good. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of this old poetry is, as I said, gnomic, or it's like wisdom poetry. It's like, we're going to tell you how life is here. These are words to live by, truths that everyone should know, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and that's what I got out of it too. You get a sense of the life they were talking about back then, and
Yep.
it was very neat, very a very interesting and fascinating lesson you gave me there, Professor. It's
Good.
outstanding.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed these little glimpses into old times.
Yep.
I appreciate you inviting me here to chat. I'm always happy to talk about Old English poetry. Um,
Yeah.
it is definitely part, and from reading my own books, the Edan Trilogy,
Yes.
it is
You.
most certainly part of my love for fantasy. Are these old poems and stories and such.
Yeah. Yeah. No. No. That was fun reading your stuff. In your trilogy here,
Yeah.
and knowing some of your influences and stuff like that, it just made the reading experience more enjoyable for me, and so I hope that people will look up some of this stuff. In conjunction maybe with reading your books,
Ah,
and Tolkien as well, and that's it just makes the whole experience I think better for everybody, when you have that frame of reference and you have that connection.
you will
You
most
can-
certainly see some of those themes in the Edan trilogy, and even certain scenes that, in my mind at least, evoke some of these old English poems,
yeah,
and where characters are looking at works of the past, Eld Entagewerk, the old works of giants. Actually,
yes,
I have a title called "The Old Works of Giants" of a chapter in the Way of
oh,
Edan.
that's
So that's a little wink,
so yeah, pay attention to the titles, folks.
in the city of Etenstone, which is basically that word "ent" again,
Yep,
Etten, which means the old stones of giants, essentially. Yeah. So yeah, that's
nice.
definitely in there. Yeah.
Yeah, very nice. All right, so there's a lot more out there than Beowulf, as as much as we love that one.
Yeah, lots
um,
more. These are just four, and there are plenty of other really great poems as well in Old English.
yeah, cool. All right, Philip, that was very enjoyable. Thank you for coming on for Book Think number 5, and I'm sure we'll be talking in the future as well.
Oh yes, most definitely. Thank you, Jared, for inviting me. This was a lot of fun.
Okay, and everybody out there, as I always say, be good to each other, and we will.